everybody. I am Rob Rebel. This is a beta test of a podcast YouTube show, episode 0 as of right now. And my co-host for tonight is Elliot Redblod Blackflag, once communist, now an anarcho-capitalist, which you don't see that often. And how you doing, Redblood?
I'm doing pretty good tonight. Yeah, kind of a rarity, I guess. Communist turned ANCAP.
You're the first one I've ever met, man. I'll be honest. I
That's
don't know
cool.
anyone else, so.
Yeah, that's cool. I know a couple socialists that gave it up too. But how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. It's been a very long day. I got my coffee here. Hopefully, have a pretty good chat with some caffeine-infused conversations.
Yeah, yeah, that might up the pace a little bit.
Well, it helps me think a little bit faster, so that's all I need. Anywho, before we start going in the conversation, I do want to talk about your transformation first from communist to anarcho-capitalist. I want to take advantage of you being on because I don't hear that ever. Everyone knows that there's so many, Ron Paul conservatives to anarcho-capitalists like myself, but no one really hears about coming from the other paradigm, going down to where you are. So can you, like, for a few minutes, talk about your transition from believing in total government to no government?
Yeah, sure. Well, I would think that for a lot of the socialists and communists, they almost don't even view it as them supporting total government. They think at the time, going from my perspective, I thought it was, a people's movement where, because there's the whole bit in the socialist propaganda of how we want the state to wither away eventually, it's kind of hard to put it together in their minds that they're actually advocating totalitarianism. And I think, one of the main things that kind of broke it all down for me was the concept of self-ownership, which was, when I started thinking of this and being asked these questions, do you own yourself, was one of the first things. And, honestly, it kind of tripped me up for a minute because essentially I was taught that I didn't, right? So when I started thinking about how everything works and people have to dig ore up out of the ground and turn it into something else and then move it, who should own the product of that individual's labor? Like, and most communists would probably say, well, the worker. What I would say now is the individual. But when I started all piecing everything together, it just started becoming obvious that under communism, no matter what you would do, your labor was never considered to be your own. There was always some other agent or group or collective that had a higher claim on your labor. So if you would make something, you were essentially inherently obligated to society, they call it, to give up all of it, essentially, a portion of it, all of it. It really doesn't matter. The principle's already been destroyed of self-ownership in that notion where if they can demand anything, that means you're essentially laboring for someone else. So when I started thinking about all that, it just all started falling apart. It was kind of easy for me, which is amazing in my view, because when I talk to other people who are still communists, it's not, it's not really that simple to just go through it in a simple line of questioning. It's easy to go through it, but to get the individual to understand it can be tricky, because we were all conditioned into believing this other stuff, that we don't own ourselves, basically, and that we are all essentially slaves to society, and everything that we do was only possible due to someone else. So therefore, you basically owe that other person, whoever it is, they don't even know who. It's just the aggregate of all humans. So once I started getting introduced to self-ownership, it basically all started to fall apart, but it really had to do with you have to want to think about it. You have to want to look at what's actually happening out there, think about what these concepts entail and these principles imply. And it just all started falling apart because it didn't make any sense for if I went out there and dug something up that I owe anybody for it. And even though a communist might say that they don't support that, if you ask other questions, like, like one time I said, if I go into the forest and I cut trees down, who do I owe someone for these trees? And a couple times communists would say, well, yeah, you owe the community or whatever. And it's like, that doesn't make any sense, like, if I went down there and labored there with my buddies and took these trees, who should own these trees? Who should have control over this wood? It would obviously be the people who cut them down. And once all that, those contradictions started getting exposed, it started falling apart. It was really arduous mentally, obviously, the dissonance and everything, because like you said, you were a minarchist or whatever, a conservative, so you're kind of going that way already, right? And as you said, I was on the completely other
Yeah,
side.
you're on
So
the other paradigm with
yeah,
total government.
yeah. So it was it was a lot of mental retching and digging through things that I thought were true or thought made sense and realizing that they didn't. And eventually, when I realized that you should own the product of your labor, I realized then that essentially all statism, since it's based on compulsory collection of other people's resources, then it violates the concept that I own myself, or the principle of self-ownership, or it's the principle of non-aggression, really, but completely destroys the concept of self-ownership. So just to me, it stopped making sense. It fell apart when I realized that each individual should have the right to own what they produce.
What were there any inspirations for you along the way, like something that was introduced to you that made you start to think differently?
I met a guy named I met a guy on an internet forum. I was in there, spewing my communist stuff, and he's the one who asked me, "Do you own yourself?" And I had to think about it, and I was like, that intrigued me enough to continue talking to him. And he introduced me to the work of Larken Rose, really, is what it was. Aside from maybe a week of him poking and prodding at my communist beliefs and me saying, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. You're not making any sense," and then me going to like work the next day or going around the neighborhood and thinking about everything, I was like, actually, wait a minute, he does make sense. What I'm saying isn't really lining up with reality. On top of it all, not only just my opinion, but when I would say what's happening, it was clearly not what was going on. Like taxes, they say they're service fees or whatever, and it's like, no, that's not actually what's happening. People
No,
are just,
it's just that.
yeah, right, it's just extortion, theft, expropriation, whatever. So it was really his name's Bill Malloy. He's got a website, nogovforme.net. It's just a little site where he's got this little quiz. He's got this quiz. It was a whole bunch of statist beliefs that he presents as a quiz, and if you it's a true or false option, and then after you finish it, he's got a whole bunch of arguments against the beliefs. And so I started going through that, and I was like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And then he introduced me to the work of Larken Rose and sent me a copy of The Most Dangerous Superstition, and within a matter of weeks, probably my entire perspective changed, reading it.
So it only took you a few weeks to go to communist to anarchist?
Yeah, basically.
Wow.
Like it maybe like a month. I mean, that was the initial switch, and then over time, I mean, even now though, I feel I'm pretty sound with everything, but over time, little things here and there that I didn't realize would be falling apart and stuff. But yeah, like I basically realized that, like Larkin's position is that there is no such thing as government. There can never be legitimate government. And since we're all taught that authority is inherently legitimate and government's inherently legitimate, that means there can't be government. And so when you realize that it's just a group of people using violence, if you have an aversion to violence or you think violence is immoral, it kind of naturally flows from that. It's a little tricky with some of the communists because they never really thought about it that way. They don't necessarily even think about if violence is immoral or not, so they'll go, sometimes they'll even go into this, there's no such thing as right and wrong, and it's like, well, okay, well then why are you upset that you're being oppressed or whatever, like if you have no rights, blah 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 blah. But yeah, it was maybe a couple weeks, and then over the next few months, it's like if you've ever read Larkin's book, which I gave one to your friend and stuff, but like when you get through the first third of it, you'll start to realize things on your own, I think, if you start to think about them, that you'll then read later in the book, because the logic is all the same. Once you unlock the logic and realize what the state is, everything else kind of falls apart on its own. Because I know...
I've seen much of his videos. I mean, one of my favorites of his is, Am I Allowed to Rob You video. And one of his most controversial, when it's okay to shoot the cop.
Yeah.
I do really want to read Most Dangerous Superstition. It's on my list. I haven't got to it yet. But I find it fascinating as you got there in just a few weeks to a month. I mean, the average joke around most liberty folk is going from minarchist to anarchist to 6 months.
Yeah.
Um, I figured for a communist that'd be at least double, not like
Yeah,
in the
at
order.
least. I mean, more like 10 years because they're
Yeah,
deep in it.
not just a few weeks.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was amazing, like, not to be or whatever, but it's a really great book. It lays it out in a very simple, straightforward way. Like, you don't even need to be like, I was always into political science and things like that, and I always considered myself to be anyway, and studied up on things like this and that. And but in my opinion, you don't even really need to be into that stuff to understand what that book is talking about, because we all just kind of understand it inherently anyway, because most people don't run around doing violence to each other. We all understand that violence is either immoral or impractical or irrational or whatever. So humans kind of have a natural aversion to it, I think, most of us. So, it's really easily accessible for everyone. And that's what I think had a lot to do with the transformation, or me giving up the myth of authority is basically what it is. Whereas if you get into too many technical terms, like if you're reading von Mises and Rothbard sometimes, there might be a lot of economic jargon that people don't understand that could confuse them, or
Yeah, well, yeah, that's one reason why I like a lot what Larken Rose does, is because he really does make it more simplistic for most people to comprehend. Because there is a lot of liberty stuff out there where they kind of go into the theoretical, and it's very lot more, you know, higher education, so to speak. Not that saying that Larken Rose isn't lower education. I'm just saying he has a way of speaking and a way of writing in which he makes it so that anyone understands logic, because he just speaks with logical reasonings.
it's basically what it is. Very straightforward. Um, a couple other guys do it too. Molyneux's pretty much just straightforward with it. He doesn't.
Molyneux can go both ways. Molyneux
Yeah,
can, he'll make some stuff like Story of Your Enslavement or stuff like that, where he breaks it down very simplistic. But, at the same time, when he's talking about DROs and other stuff, like, what would a free society really look like? That's where it gets more into like the technical aspects of, where do we go? Now we know the ideology. How do we get there? What do we do?
yeah. Well, in my view, it's not complicated, and it doesn't have to be.
It's not at all.
It's really simple. What we're fighting mostly is conditioning.
Yes.
We're fighting things that have been drilled into our head for 12 years or more, at least. At least 8 for most people.
Well, it's generational. I mean, our our parents, our grandparents, our great grandparents, all going way way back, all of them have been conditioned to think the way they think, and to think that there's some sort of authority over them.
Right.
And it's trying to break generational uh, conditioning, or I mean, you can say brainwash. I really wouldn't use brainwashing, but conditioning is a good word. Uh, of this mentality that somehow some group of people that we've never met have some sort of authority over us.
Yeah. All right. Or just some other person. Period. Yeah. Like, that's one thing that I find interesting about like the libertarian, or what is it? Murray Bookchin. He's basically a communist. He's a libertarian municipalism, or whatever he calls it. Like basically really small communism, like this. It's like a localized communism. It's just all kind of the same thing, like that's what I bring that up is because some people we didn't know, like they can sometimes say that, like, who are these people on the other side of the country or the region or whatever telling us what we can and can't do? So instead we want our neighbors to do it. That's where like Murray Bookchin kind of it strikes me as funny, like,
Yeah,
okay,
I
we we'd
I
rather have
agree. I
our
mean, it's one of those things where people on the other side. Go ahead, go ahead.
no, go ahead, you can go ahead, I was done.
Yeah, I lost the lag for a second. That's why. Anywho, but no, I mean, it's even if someone you do know somehow claims authority over you. I just like using, someone I don't know, because honestly, I've never met any of these politicians.
Yeah.
How can they claim, ownership over me? And you can make, but it kind of just brings it down even farther. Like, so what if I know this person or they know me? They still don't have any kind of real authority. I kind of try to break it down where if I can't do something to you, why do you think it's okay if someone you've never met has the authority to do that to you? Well, it doesn't matter what it
Yeah.
is, you know. But
Right,
anywho,
exactly.
let's talk about some of the stuff that was going on this weekend. The veterans tearing down the barriers to the World War II memorial. Didn't they take the barriers to the White House and set it in front or something like that?
Yeah, it says they took them over there to the capital area or whatever. But yeah, I mean, that what is that? That's anarchy, right?
Yeah.
That's some
But
dangerous anarchists there.
well, it doesn't make sense to me is these people, that are doing that protest, I give them credit for what they're doing, disobeying orders and not complying with the state, but at the same time, they support that government, you
Yeah.
know? So it's like this is the government that you have, that you want, that you support. You just don't support what they're doing. I just don't support them, period.
Right, right, period. Well, that's like, I mean, that's usually what it is for most everyone that still believes in government. Is it's our people versus their people. Whoever they would be, it doesn't matter. As long as it's my people bossing everyone around, it's okay in their mind. Because I mean, they all accept. I mean, here's what's interesting though: is like even these people, they might not like what they're doing, but if they still believe in authority, what's their what's their beef? Like when I say, I'll ask them, well, does the state impose regardless of consent? And they'll think about it, and maybe usually they'll say yeah, and then I'll say, well, then what are you complaining about? If you're just going to accept that they have the right to rule in the first place, why are you even voting? If you going to accept, if you go into voting or whatever, just accepting that you're supposed to obey the outcome, why even vote? It just doesn't make any sense. But yeah,
Well,
all the
they want to vote so that their person can decide what the other people have to follow.
right,
I
right.
mean, still, at the end of the day, it's like, do you really want to follow what the other group of people want you to do? And if a no, then why would you want to impose your will on other people then?
Right, yeah. Yeah, that's like a couple I've noticed people, well, if I expect freedom and liberty, I kind of have to give that to other people, and that would mean I can't be telling them what they can and can't do in their private lives, and passing all types of nonsense so-called laws about what you can do on your property, and you know but yeah, well, like, they're obviously all statists and things, but at least they're understanding that there's something clearly corrupt going on here, especially when the nature of the way that all of this stuff is paid for. Everything that the state has ever built was built on blood money, essentially, so I mean, who really owns those memorials to close them off, or the parks and everything? It's like clearly just being claimed as private property.
Well, they do have a point, because the World War II memorial was, to my knowledge, was funded by private donations. The government had nothing to do with actually building it. I mean,
Okay.
they facilitate it with park police and whatnot, but to my knowledge, that was completely paid with private funds. But even then, it's still run by the government,
Yeah,
and
well, even
it,
more
it,
so then they have no claim to be barricading it then. Yeah, right, or closing it off, so they just
Well, like I said, I don't know. Like with these, with the protesters that are there, I love the fact that they're completely disobeying orders, you know. But at the same time, it's like, what are you gonna go to? You're still gonna, you still want some sort of people to have this authority. You just don't want the person in the White House to have that authority,
yeah, right.
you know.
They don't like the current emperor. But it's
Speaking of, oh, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, but it's essentially meaningless if they don't like him. I mean, the whole belief is that they have the right to impose anyway. Where to me it isn't meaningless. I support that they don't support this whole thing, but the belief to even think Barack Obama's government or has authority just kind of like you kind of like lose the whole thing anyway, because if he's authority, then what are you going to say?
Speaking of, I just want to go on a little bit of a rant. Here's my thing. All right, now if these conservatives and whatnot are really protesting Obama because they've kind of moved more toward a libertarian angle, and they understand that Bush's policies were wrong, and Obama's policies are wrong for the same reasons, then I'll give them support. But sometimes, especially with a lot of Tea Partiers I run into, I would say a third of them, they get it. They're more libertarian. They just hold on to that minarchist part where they still think of some sort of government. But a lot of people that kind of claim that Tea Party mantle, a majority of them, unfortunately, they just don't like Democrats. They don't like, and they don't like Obama because he's a Democrat. And my thing is, why aren't all these conservatives, if logic, well, that's assuming that logic actually plays a role. Uh, why aren't these conservatives supporting Obama because he has not changed one Bush policy?
Right.
Am I wrong? I mean, everyone's
Right.
still pro-war. There's pro-surveillance. I mean,
Still a corporatist.
still a corporate, still gets all the funding from the Wall Street. Still big on the Fed. So the drug war still continues. What has changed in the last 8 years since from Bush to Obama?
Yeah, right. Nothing good, if anything. But right, well, I mean, it ties into what you said earlier about how, or what we were talking about, what you mentioned, where it's just they don't like the other side. That's the whole belief. It's us versus them, and it's really state versus everyone else. But they, a lot of people came to libertarianism, and I wouldn't necessarily call everyone who calls themselves Tea Parties libertarians. Maybe they don't even. But
it depends. Well, if you know the history of the Tea Party was originally created by pretty much remnants of Ron Paul's campaign back in '08, and a lot of Tea Partiers were pretty much libertarians that were, pretty much after that campaign still wanted to do something. But
yeah.
then after like 6 months, it was completely taken over by the Republican Party, and it lost all of its, the meat to the movement. It became a conservative movement instead of a libertarian movement. Just like
Well,
how the
right.
Democrats took over and then killed Occupy Wall Street. They did the same. The Democrats did the same thing to the left.
Yeah. Well, right. Well, there's like, well, right. There's like I'm sure there's a lot of people who are genuinely concerned, and they do understand that this, is fascism or corporatism or socialism or whatever you want to call it going on. But right, they don't have a sound understanding of the principles. They're Republicans who rightfully, in my view, got upset with the Republican Party, and then they kind of drifted off, and they heard this thing called libertarianism, and they liked what Ron Paul was talking about, and they just kind of like went there, and it became the new Republican Party. It was like, this is what the Republican Party is supposed to be about, is what in their minds, I think, a lot of what's happening. And they just don't dig into the history of what we would call libertarianism. It's just the same, it's limited government and states' rights and all of the same general things that the Republicans use as propaganda.
No, here's my thing. If the Republicans really did believe in states' rights, which they only do for their own agenda, it depends on the situation. But if they
Yeah.
really did believe in states' rights, most Republicans by now should be supporting secession. That'd be the
Yeah,
ultimate states' rights.
yeah, that's a good point, right?
Because at least one, I'd rather have no government, period. But if I had, I would work with people if they're in support of a secessionist movement. At least getting rid of one layer of government is better than having all of it there remaining. I'd
Well,
rather get
right.
rid of at least the federal government.
Well, if we could get them to the point where they'll, or I don't know, that kind of said that wrong, but if an individual comes to the point where they would support secession, yeah, I would think, now, like Rothbard's quote about, if the United States and Canada can be separate and not be considered an impermissible state of anarchy, why can't the state secede? Why can't the city secede? Why can't the block? Then eventually down to the individual.
Yeah.
And that's like, if we could get it, if there was at least that type of movement happening, maybe that would cause some momentum to push people to think towards, well, why can't the individual why can't I just, go with a different defense agency, or something like that, which of course we know the state isn't an actual proper defense agency, but it would maybe spark a little bit of thought in their mind, hopefully. But yeah, I think that's a pretty good perspective, right? If you say you favor states' rights, but secession's not even really on the table. It was for a little while. I remember some people talking about it, but it's just kind of like, well, now the government's shut down, so what are we going to do about that?
Speaking of a government shutdown, it's such a joke because
Yeah.
especially for people like us who don't believe in government, for them first off to tease it and then it actually happening. But the whole tease to me is nothing more than like a huge strip tease. where it's like, come on, like, I want to shut it down. I was like, well, shut it down, baby. And
Yeah,
you know,
it took off a glove.
yeah, it's like they took off, not even a glove. It's like, it's like they unbutton one button. I'm like, we're shut down. I'm like,
Yeah.
no, that's nothing at
Yeah.
all. You know,
Well, I mean,
I,
now, the way information spreads, like perhaps your audience or whatever, we've all kind of been thinking about this, where it's obviously a scam. I mean, they're paying people to kick people out of places they never did before. Even they still got armed enforcers running around. They're still doing all these things. They're, closing up the politicians' private parks or whatever you want to call them. It's obvious at this point. Couldn't be more obvious if they put a private property of Barack Obama or John Boehner's sign on the friggin' gate. But yeah, it's pretty wild how it's all going, and still some people still believe. They really believe it. They're true believers. Oh, the government shut down. The Republicans are holding the government hostage, and the Republicans will say, well, the Democrats are trying to force through this totalitarian healthcare thing, and that's why we're shutting down the government. So you're not shutting down anything. The politicians are obviously in cahoots. It's still up and running. Or they cut like 16% of it or whatever it was.
yeah,
Which,
that's like,
who even knows how they came up with that number? It's just could just be made up. I still see armed enforcers. I still see people closing up parks. What I call it is the Orwellian Enclosure Act. That's basically what I view it to be. It's like completely Orwellian. They're calling it a shutdown, but they're proactively going and closing things up, even places that they never even rendered any so-called services to and things. So it's mind-blowing how faithful they really are in the words that come out of politicians' mouths. It's insane. Like, the government shut down. The politician came on TV and told me so. Like, if the government shut down, we wouldn't have any politicians on TV. Like they would just have went home or been kicked out of the area, or who knows, being extortionists.
yeah. I mean, the shutdown, it is very Orwellian because it's not shut down at all. It's pretty much they took away all the stuff people like to do. If they pay us more money, or let us steal more, and maybe we'll let you go to a park or a zoo or an ocean, like, or whatever. Like there's like parks they close along the ocean. Like, how the hell do you close an ocean? Or how do you close the Grand Canyon?
Yeah,
You
right,
know?
exactly.
I mean, come on. But
Yeah.
yeah, I just find it very fascinating that these people, they're freaking out the government shut down. Like I posted earlier this weekend, I stopped at Starbucks for a coffee, and like their Starbucks has petitions that you can sign in Starbucks, and they'll send it to DC to beg the government to reopen and figure out a budget. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
you're asking people to sign a document that encourages other groups of people that I've never met to steal more of my money to pay for a debt that is not mine.
Right, exactly.
And all I want to do is buy some coffee from you.
Yeah, right. And you're gonna shove this in here. Well, I mean, if they want to put that up there, whatever. But I mean, that's what I view it as, right? Like you said, they're taking away the things that people like to do in order to make it seem like we need them. It's like, oh, bring them back now. Oh, the government shut down. That means the government shut down. That means the Grand Canyon's closed. So we need to give more of our money to politicians so they can reopen the Grand Canyon. It's like, no. I mean, who can close the Grand Canyon in the first place is really what the question I think we should be asking. But they, yeah, very Orwellian. It's all psychological,
Yeah,
I mean.
close like land. Yeah.
Yeah, just wide open spaces that existed for.
You can kind of relate. You can kind of relate it to like a wife or girlfriend that's very upset with you. So there ain't no romancing going on because you're not doing what you're supposed to do or whatnot. That's what reminds me of the government. It's like a lover that is pissed off at you, so they're not. They're still operating. They're doing all the bad stuff. They're just not doing the good stuff for you.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's like, yeah, I'm gonna hold this.
Do something to make you miss them.
Yeah, right. That's exactly what it is. Which it's interesting is too, they never even left, right? They're just kind of like holding back, and they laid all these people off, which is unfortunate given the circumstances, but ultimately my position and argument is that those jobs shouldn't even exist since they're
Exactly.
funded by extortion. And that's like a hard thing for people to really talk about objectively and rationally, because it's completely emotional. It's a completely emotional, superstitious, religious belief. But
Somebody's paying for somebody's kid's dinner, man. You fire
right,
somebody, I hear that pain. I get that. But at the same time, you're right that those positions were paid for with extortion.
right.
So how can that money was stolen to begin with? It's not money that was voluntarily paid for those services.
Right, right. It's not like, they view it as if it was just like a layoff from a regular agency or company, but it isn't, right? It's a company that forced you to pay for it in the first place, and that's where, with all of the emotional ties and right, there are some valid. I mean, I understand where they're coming from. Like you said, it's like you're taking food off my family's table by laying me off with this nonsense because you politicians, blah blah blah. But right, ultimately, it's still just a distraction from the principles and the fundamental reality, which is the state is just an extortion racket that people believe is authority. So um, it's hard to talk about that when everybody's worrying about when they're going to get their next paycheck or how they're going to feed their family. And they know that. I mean, the entire thing is it's all psychological, right? Like if people don't believe that they're authority and that if they don't believe that they need them, then the whole game is up. If people start to realize that, that's one reason why I think what's like, not like there's some mastermind up there thinking all this, though I'm sure there are some people that completely understand this and manipulate people. um, they couldn't leave the parks open because then people would understand that we don't need them. So they need to continually make people think that we need them, and they provide
We
some
need them
service.
not to use the cops to close down parks. That's what we need them for. We need the government open so that things aren't so
So
they
that,
don't use money to close things.
yeah, to close things that aren't even theirs on top of it, right? Like there's
Yeah.
no possible way. Like if they would have just left it open and somebody would have taken up the task, even if it were just random visitors. I mean, it's like when we walk around, if there's a piece of trash in the park or something, we'll probably pick it up just because whatever. So it's like most people, they don't want to go to the park if it looks like crap. So someone has an interest in doing that. We all do basically. So, but if they would have let people just go in there, it would have destroyed their whole facade. Which is mind blowing because it's amazing to me that really that it's kind of what I think would happen, but it's not happening when they're straight closing the parks up. People still believe it. Like there's a lot of liberty-minded people that get it, but I mean, I talk to some Democrats and they're literally just true believers. They try to justify everything the DNC and Barack Obama and stuff does, and I'm just like, how could you justify closing down what you call, national parks? It's like either it belongs to the nation, which of course is nonsense too, or which would be us, which means it's just open, or it belongs to the politicians and they have the right to close it. And that's clearly what they believe because they fenced it off, they barricaded it, they closed it. Of course, they did a really poor job, thankfully, in a lot of places with just their little cheap barricades that we just talked about. The veterans were just picking up and taken back to the White House. So I mean, there's a lot of ways, a lot of places that people are understanding and don't care, so they just are going with it anyway. And that's anarchy. Basically, it's just you know, we don't need the state there to do things that we can do ourselves, and there's nothing that they can do that we can't do ourselves except for rob people basically, and get people to believe it's okay. That's the only so-called service that the state provides, which is unique, which is extortion. It's not even unique, just the whole, like I like Bastiat, he talks about the concept of legal plunder and all this. Ultimately, legal is meaningless, right? It's like just saying we said we could do it. So like legal is essentially meaningless, but hopefully it'll start to raise awareness, because if people get more media showing them like, look, these people don't care about these barricades, it's not right, we understand that this is not right, so we're going to just simply disobey. That's really all it would take, as long as that message takes off. Of course, if they still believe in authority and government, it's going to happen again eventually. But I think it's providing a pretty good example of why we don't need government, because they're just running around causing impositions now when they're shut down. They shut down and they cause more,
They
they
cause
just
more
causes
problem being shut down than they do being open.
being open. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what it's seeming in those particular instances, right? When they weren't closed and people could have just went in there whenever. Now they're creating a problem where there wasn't one, which is basically what they do by definition.
Well,
But
my thing is, especially with the shutdown, like going further into it, it's like, first off, the Fed can just have money. So why don't they just print more money? I mean, they're already printing money now as it is. What's the difference if they just use that for the government? Second off, um, like the whole, like last month, they were, the war drums were beating really hard. I mean, we came, like this close to, bombing the hell out of Syria. And that would have cost trillions of dollars.
yeah,
Moving all of our. I mean, the. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say we. They,
yeah,
that's we is a is a curse word among anarchists.
individualist, right? Yeah,
Yeah, so like it's not we, it's not my government, but I mean they moved all those aircraft carriers and battleships and whatnot to the Mediterranean, the Middle East and whatnot. That had to cost billions of dollars, So like they moved it all there anyways. But they're pushing this war, which probably would have lasted for months and months, if not a year or so, if we even had ground troops on in there. And yet somehow a couple of weeks later, they don't even have enough money for a budget.
yeah, right.
I'm like, how is that possible?
Yeah. Well, they haven't supposedly they haven't been operating on a budget in quite some time now, but right, it's like we're talking about $1 trillion war expenditure months, and a month ago, and then all of a sudden, how were you even planning that? It's obviously a scam. You're sitting here if people, I think, if there would have been mass support, I mean, they'll probably do it anyway. They don't care, but they have to try to get people at least to think it's somewhat legitimate, or at least some portion of the population. But I think that's all it really was. If there wasn't as much anti-war sentiment, they probably would have just went through with it. It doesn't have anything to do with the money. It's all fake anyway, right? Like you said, they can just print more of it. So if they could just print more of it, granted, it'll have some effects on what they call the economy, but they could it's a couple keystrokes, a couple keystrokes, and now this guy's got two more zeros at the end of his balance. So now let's just go make these bombs and do this and that. So they can justify coming up with money for war, but then they can't maintain the parks and stuff. And yeah, it's complete nonsense. It's so blatantly obvious at this point. Excuse me, but that's the thing. Is like we said, we're fighting conditioning. We're fighting conditioning because you could explain and show examples on how it makes absolutely no sense to your blue in the face, but if they're not willing to try to fight the conditioning and fight through the dissonance and reason through it, then it's never going to change in their mind. They have to do it themselves. They have to think about it. But
well, I mean, you can only, in my opinion, from my experience talking to others, you can pretty much only show them the door. They have to want to open it. You can't. It's one of those things where you can't just force someone to
understand
let
it.
go and not to understand. They have to want to. Yeah, they have to want to, understand, go through that door and see what's on the other side. We can show them that, but there's nothing we can do to force them. Because I kind of find that the more and more I try to force someone to view the way I view things or whatnot, it's just pushing them farther away. It's kind of like you need to lead them in, not you know, put your views on them, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I still got a little bit where I'll come off a little bit abrasive and whatnot, because it's just like, how can you not see this? But I mean, how could I have been a communist and then gave that up? So it's like I try to be understanding and just be polite and mostly just ask questions and
Well, no, I'm the same way. Sometimes I get frustrated when I'm talking to someone that's not there. Um, but I try to always remind myself that, like you got there pretty quickly, but even then, not everyone does. Not, it takes a long time for a lot of people. It did for me. And when you're talking to somebody, you might put that seed of doubt in their mind. They may question something, and they may go look up something or do some research of their own at some point. That's the only thing we can always hope for whenever we're trying to win over someone. Is like you're not going to win them over in one conversation. I don't think anyone ever has, and probably nobody ever will.
Right.
But at least you can plant that seed of doubt where at some point that person will be won over. But it does take a while for that person to think about it.
Right. Right. The individual has to. Right. If you could get to one point where you ask a question and it really gets them to start thinking about it, if one of my friends says he's like, well, just give them time, give them time. Like if they're on the path to analyzing what government is in the state and they think something's wrong and they're already questioning it, it seems like it's only a matter of time. Eventually they'll go further and further down the road, but at the same time I'm not sure, because I know people that have been libertarians and they still are, like, so
Yeah, how do you get stuck on libertarian? Like, how do you get stuck on minarchist libertarian?
yeah.
I was one, so I'm kind of like, why? Why did you stop?
Yeah.
Why did you stop at just limited government restored republic folk? Because that's where I came from, and I used to be there for a couple years, but I finally moved on past that. And I can understand if you're not exposed to certain things. I mean, sometimes you need to be exposed to certain ideas and whatnot. But if you are exposed to that idea, why is it that they, don't make that jump, don't get to that uh, jump point where they finally let go? And I'm trying to help other people out with that with some of my videos, but I don't know. Some people just get stuck on that minarchist libertarian angle.
Yeah. Well, the large thing I think with that is limited government and libertarians and minarchists, or whatever you want to call them, their conditioned belief and response is they believe that government or the state or whatever, it's just mostly government, they think it could be a good thing in perpetuity, right? Like if we could just get the proper system, which is basically kind of what everybody thinks, but they really hold on firmly to that belief, that because they look in the past and they see what they think was a free society or a free market system or whatever you want to call it. It wasn't really, because of their whole conditioning to not think about what the state actually is. So they think that if we could just get back to that, it would be okay, because that was a free society and we've got this and that. Of course, it doesn't even matter to them that most of it was based on slavery, and taxation is theft. Of course, that's one of the things that really blows my mind about libertarians is I will ask them if taxation is theft, and they will say yes, and somehow they'll still end up talking about voting, and that's why we need to vote. That's why we need better politicians. It's like,
Well, you know, being one of those at one point, they view at least income tax as theft, and or most taxation as theft, and they would say, well, we need to remove the 16th Amendment, and while we're at it, we should remove the 15th Amendment, which allows senators to be voted on by general populace, and restore it back to being a republic and get rid of the income tax, with the 16th.
yeah.
And I see what they're saying, I get that, but
Well, I ask
you
them,
know,
what about Article 1, Section 8 then? Why
yes,
why do we
Article One,
stop there?
Section 8. Yeah, I mean that Article 1, Section 8 is by far the worst part of the United States Constitution. It gives these small group of people the power to steal, the power to murder via war, the power to monopolize the currency. I mean, it's
Yep.
all of it, like all the powers of Congress. Like, no, not one single person, not one single human being should have those rights or those privileges or powers, whatever you want to call it, the authority. But somehow this document that was written over 200 years ago gives people today this power over
Yeah,
us.
purports to give them. Yeah, right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I get into a lot of 16th Amendment discussions, and that's That's what I'm like. Well, what about Article 1, Section 8? That says Congress have the power to lay and collect taxes right there. So what's bad about the income tax versus
because it's
taxation in general?
proportional or some bullshit like that.
Yeah, right. Well, and, what I say too is I usually say, well, I mean, is there such thing as a tax that's not an income tax? I mean, that we have all these little spurious differentiations, excise and other things, but what's the difference? Like,
At
where's
the end of
where's
the day, it's still coming from your income.
from your income, right? Like, where's taxation who's gonna pay taxes if it's not coming from someone's income? Like the way that their whole market or their whole society, economic system works. I can understand a little bit of the confusion because there's all of this like counterfeit value that they're floating around through society that they can pull from that pool. Like they have this little counterfeit allotment of so-called value or wealth rather, and it kind of, it's not coming from their income, it's coming from their you know some other aspect of their profit margins or something like this. And it's like, well, I mean, that's still, someone had to generate wealth first. Nobody's paying taxes if there's nothing to tax. So it all comes from some individual or some group's income or what they've produced. Like taxation's like a levy on production. If you produce, then they demand something from it, even if it's just two people and he didn't produce anything but he created a sale. They're essentially trading value here. So then here comes a third party and he's going to demand a sales tax or whatever, and then he's going to say, well, if it wasn't for me, you guys wouldn't even have a road or whatever. Like, and tariffs and things like that. Like, some people still are talking about tariffs, and it's like, it's mercantilism. Like, it's all basically mercantilism. But like, how can you it's interesting to me. I can't understand, because of my whole transformation and everything like that. Why stop at the income tax? That's what I'm saying. What is the income tax, period? But why stop at the IRS? If it's bad for the federal government to force you to pay for things, why would it be okay for the state to do it, or for anyone? Period. That's the thing. But it's conditioning. We were literally.
What's worse is I see these so-called libertarians advocating, well, we'll get rid of the IRS, we'll get rid of all the income tax, get rid of the 16th Amendment, we'll get rid of every tax under the sun. And like, I'm all with them. I'm like, hell yes, right on, brother. And then they're like, and we'll replace it all with the fair tax, a 23% sale tax on everything.
Yeah, the fair tax.
Like, I just want to slap my head against the wall, and I'm like, how
Yeah.
do you like do a complete 180? I remember watching. Did you watch during the last presidential election the third-party debates that were on? I think I talked about this earlier beforehand, where they had Gary Johnson, Jill Stein, and I
Yeah.
forgot the name of the other people. But like, that's what Gary Johnson was saying. He's like, we'll get rid of the Fed, we'll get rid of the IRS, we'll get rid of all this, the wars, and then we're gonna replace it with a fair tax.
Yeah. Right. So you just.
It's like how he's like getting off out of my seat. I'm like, Gary Johnson, and I'm like, oh, you just destroyed my dreams, Gary.
Yeah, right. Well, that's like you said, you slap your head off the wall. I mean, that's what he did. He just ran into a brick wall right there. Like, what? I mean, that's what I ask the libertarians too. I say, is taxation theft? If they say, yeah, I'm like, is there a politician that is 100% opposed to taxation? I'll have to think about it for a minute, and then like one guy might have even said Gary Johnson. I was like, Gary Johnson's not opposed to taxation. I mean, you can't really, like I say, if you show me a politician that actually opposes taxation, and I'll show you like a narcissist that wants to kill himself or something. It's like, why are you running for office, to put yourself out of business? Like, why don't you just not go to the office then? Why don't we just ignore these people and realize that it's extortion? But that's the hard thing, is realizing it.
Well, my thing is, I agree with you on that. However, like for me and a lot of other people, I wouldn't be a voluntarist or an anarchist, whatever you want to, ANCAP, if I haven't been exposed to Ron Paul running for president.
Sure.
So I'm not really, as much as I want to say don't participate in the system, don't operate within the system, and I do say that, live free now and do whatever you can not to be within the system. That being said, I have no problem with liberty-minded folk infiltrating the system as long as they don't ask me to vote for them. If they're
Right.
using it as an educational tool to wake up others, you're going into the wolves' den or whatnot. You're going into enemy territory. But if you're spreading the message, I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah, right. I mean, as long as that's what they're doing. Where I mean, but that's even like I totally get what you're saying with Ron Paul and stuff. Like for me, it wasn't about that, because um, like I said, like we said, I was a commie, and so Ron Paul wouldn't have been my guy, period, at the time. But I understand that once I come to realize it all, it's like, right, I don't care, it's like, who am I to say anyway what they go and do like that? But um, ultimately, I don't, Ron Paul is a catalyst, but then Molyneux, Rose, Stefan Kinsella, all those individuals, they like bring people over, they push them over the edge, hopefully, not forcibly. Now they're not going to initiate any type of immoral force, but philosophically bring them over the edge to completely give up statism entirely, which right, that's Ron Paul did a lot to raise awareness for certain ideas and things. Where I think he fell short was, granted, I never read much of what he actually authored. I mostly just go off of his public addresses and things like that. I don't see him really diving into the principles. You know, um, it's one thing to talk about we shouldn't have government involving itself in our milk stand, or I mean our lemonade stands and farmers producing milk and things like that. But I mean, the same thing to turn around and advocate states' rights and things. Uh, that's where they all fall short, because I mean, the state necessarily, by definition, by nature, is a violent aggressor, which violates the principles. So, but it does a good thing to get people thinking along those lines. Like I totally agree with that. Ron Paul did a lot in that regard. His son, nah, I don't, not so much. Even though a lot of people are kind of flocking to him.
Don't get me started on Rand Paul. That'd be another couple hours of me ranting about him, man. I can't stand Rand. Stand with him. I know some people they'll make the case like, well, we should stand with Rand when he's right on issues. I'm like, right on issues. Yeah, don't get me wrong. I oppose drones as much as the next person, but he endorsed a candidate that supports using drones to kill people. And on top of that, including Americans. And then, like a couple weeks later, he goes on Fox saying how he has no problem with using a drone to kill someone that walked out of a liquor store with a gun for like $50 or something like that.
Wow.
And yeah, and he flip flops over all that stuff all the time. It depends. And then he's pro drug war. He's talked a
Yeah, I
good.
know that. That's my
Yeah.
main thing that I try to bring up. Like, how are you pro drug war and people call you a libertarian?
Well, on
Like,
top, not just it's just not pro drug war. I mean, he's pro war. He's pro drug war. He's pro surveillance state. He's um, I remember right after he won the election, and whatnot. After he endorsed Romney, uh, me being a coming from also from the truther movement and whatnot, because I kind of evolved out of that. I've always been following Luke Rudkowski of We Are Change, because that's I was in that you know way of thinking before, so I still follow him and whatnot. And him, and what's the name of the Abby Martin? She hosts that show on Russia Today, Breaking the Set. Anyways,
okay, yeah.
her and Luke Rudkowski um, confronted Rand Paul on the endorsements of Mitt Romney. They ran into him in the Senate, and he completely ignored him, like completely ignored Luke, and went after Abby Martin, where he was able to try and get he was trying to get uh, the Senate police, that's like the Capitol Police or whatnot, to arrest her for not being there with the proper badge or something like
All
that.
right,
He tried to
right.
get her fired from her job. And what's crazy is when he was running for office, he was all about talking about the Bilderberg and, like, Wall Street and the Fed and he was like actually talking about that with Luke Radowski, and it's like he knows who he is. They've had conversations before, but now that he's somehow a senator, that he can't be bothered but with answering questions as why did you endorse someone that completely opposes everything that you ran on,
Yeah.
you know?
Right. Well, yeah, right. I mean, it's just goes back to just how truly faithful statists are, because right there, I mean, the whole thing with the Obama and the Romney Care thing, it's like, and Biden and the Patriot Act and all this stuff. It's, how but they still truly believe that these people are not only actual enemies, but philosophically opposed. They're not even philosophically opposed. I mean, you can't be when you're a statist. It's all basically the same fundamental belief. So, but yeah, it just goes to show, like, I mean, how blatantly contradictory they are, and how they contradict them, or how they go against what they say their principles are. It's just like Abe Lincoln with his whole first inaugural address, where he says, I have no desire to interfere with slavery whatsoever. He says, I don't have the legal authority to do so. And it's like, that's, the implications of that are profound, and people just gloss right over him. It's like, he was, Abe Lincoln basically just said, slavery's okay if the government says it's law, And then later, of course, he flipped basically his whole script and started talking all this anti-slavery stuff, and it was just basically a war for territory.
Lincoln did the Emancipation Proclamation only to prevent, in my opinion, England from getting into the war, because it was pretty much a political statement, because they had already outlawed slavery at that time.
Yeah.
But a lot of people don't realize, like, for the most part, Lincoln is a mass murderer, because he's responsible for killing over 600,000 Americans, almost a million. All right. He didn't give a shit about slavery.
No, yeah, right.
Unless it suited his political interests.
Right.
And on top of that, it was all about money and control. He blockaded all the seaports, and the thing was, a majority of the tax revenue came from those seaports in the South, not from because there's more ports in the South than there were in the North. They were losing over 50% of their income, because there wasn't a income tax at that time. If you want to restored republic folk, but they did get, there were user fees and taxes and all that jazz coming from the ports, so they're losing a lot of income. It was all about maintaining their territory of revenue. That's what it was about.
Right,
and
exactly.
He killed, he's responsible for killing, close to 1 million. And at least I know it's almost 700,000, but there's
it was 600 something thousand is what I've heard. Yeah,
I know that's just troops alone, but there's lots of million deaths.
Right, and he conscripted people, so he just did slavery himself, implemented slavery himself, and violated First Amendment, or violated the right of free speech by closing down dissident newspapers, and he did all of this tyrannical stuff. And I mean, it's just the same thing where they flip flop. It's literally, like you said, it's a political ploy. That's essentially what all politicians are doing. Even if they mean well, they're going to end up contradicting themselves if they say they advocate freedom, just because of the nature of the state.
Is treated as if like he's some sort of hero in this country.
And
don't get me wrong, I oppose slavery in any way, shape, or form. In my personal opinion, anarchists, specifically ANCAPs and voluntarists, in my opinion, are the highest form of abolitionists.
Yeah.
Because we don't believe anyone should have any ownership over anybody, and on any level. But that being said, like, he ended chattel slavery, even though it was for political reasons. But he made everyone in this landmass known as the United States a slave, because it set forth that the federal government has the authority to prevent you from leaving the tax farm.
Yeah.
And they will do everything under their power, including killing hundreds of thousands of people, to prove that they have that authority.
Right, exactly. Right. I mean, right, that's just war for territory, war for wealth, and it's essentially all of it is. Every war, I can't remember who said this, but this says every war is just it's just overtaxation, which is theft. It's just who's gonna be the guy with the big stick around here telling everybody they got to give them their money,
Yeah.
And if somebody has established such a belief in an area and then somebody questions it or starts saying, no, we're not going to pay anymore, right? You know, I mean, the thing is that they truly believe it at the same time. It's not, I mean, granted, it's all just violent war, but I mean, these individuals truly believe that they do have the authority in most cases. You know, that's where it's just so mind blowing. Like, they're not just hypocrites. They don't just contradict themselves. They really believe that stuff, and that's where it's really it's tricky and it's mind blowing to me that people have come to believe that, and that, you know, even we believed it at one point, you know. But it's when you understand it all, you can see why. It's conditioning. It's your, like you said, your family and generations just being taught this lie. But they really truly come to believe it. I mean, even as Larken Rose, he mentions, you know, he's like, this is the religion that most people actually believe in, because even if some holy movement or some religious movement has certain rules, you know, they all necessarily believe that you're supposed to bow to the state.
Well,
Like,
statism is the most dangerous religion known to man. I mean, look at the democide that, death by government in the last century. With, what is it, like 40 million people, 400? I don't. Millions of people have been
more
killed
than
in the
that,
last.
yeah.
I forgot the exact numbers, but the amount of
I
people
think
that killed.
Mao, they attribute Mao with like something like
Oh yeah,
60 million on his own.
yeah. It's close to, like, I think 200 million, like, around the world.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's the most dangerous belief that humans have come to perpetuate.
And most people
Definitely.
don't realize that they practice this religion. They just think that's the normal thing to do. That's that these people have authority. I'm gonna operate with their you know with all their papers and documents, and do I'm gonna go to their holy their holy buildings known as, like, the DMV or whatever.
Yeah, right.
And
All
I'm
the
gonna
little state
and I'm,
temples.
I'm gonna make my I'm gonna donate to the church so that they give me the privilege of being able to have a card in my wallet so I can drive a vehicle, or just whatever bullshit.
Yeah,
And
right. Whatever it
you
is,
gotta
right.
you gotta you gotta pay some sort of sacrifice to do something.
Right. Well, right. That's what I mean. That's what it is. It's like they ransom your own freedom to you. You know, they say, I mean, I like how you said that you pay them for the privilege, right? What you're paying the state for is the privilege to be free or to be alive, basically, you know, in their mind. I mean, we're at the position that you have the right to live, you have the right to life and the right to self-defense, but the way that their belief and system works, you're paying them for the privilege to exist. Because if you come to owe them in their mind for whatever, they're going to come initiate force, and if you justly defend yourself, you know, they'll shoot you dead, essentially, and believe that they're in the right. That's the really frightening and, you know, scary and it's just mind-blowing aspect is they truly believe it. It's not like they're just some thug pretending, though some of them definitely are. Most people really believe it, and I mean, it's led to, you know, massive murders and destruction throughout history, but, you know, maybe this time if we vote, it'll work out for us. You know, that's what they all believe, which, you know, there's a reason that it happens that way, and it's because it's the belief in authority. It's the belief that they have the right to impose even against consent. That's my whole thing with the libertarians and is taxation theft. I ask them, does the state rule by force? Does it impose regardless of your consent anyway? And, you know, like I said, they say yeah, and then okay, well, so then what does that mean? What is the state? What is government? You know, it's just a violent aggressor. But that's the part that's really hard to see, because it's the exact same thing happening in reality. But if your perspective is that that guy has the right to rule you, even though they would never say it that way, personally, I don't think I've ever had them come out and just say, I mean, I'll ask them, do politicians have the right to rule you? And sometimes they'll say, yeah. And then they'll go on some nonsense about elections and how that gave them the right. And it's like, I mean, they don't understand the concept of right, of rights, inalienable rights, sovereignty, individual liberty, stuff like that. So, you know, right, they don't really understand what right means. You know, if that's their right, then the election and everything else is meaningless. You know, so
As long as there's an election, then everything's okay, and then they have some sort of authority to do something, even though, like, you look at the presidential election, almost a little bit less than half the country even votes,
yeah,
and half of that even actually votes for the person that won. So a quarter of the population voted for Obama, and it's somehow this entire government has some sort of legitimate authority uh, to
Yeah.
rule over everyone, when in fact, like, only a quarter of the population is responsible for voting. What happens when only a quarter of the population votes and only 1/8 voted for the president,
Yeah.
or
Right.
less than that? And it's going to get to the point where, at what point, when people just stop voting, will, even the people that don't vote still somehow think that, because, well, I didn't vote, but that's because if I didn't vote, then I just don't have a right to complain. I'm like,
Yeah.
no, you
They'll
have a
even
right
say
to
that.
complain.
Yeah. They'll even say. Sometimes they'll even say that. Right. Well, that's like an interesting thing that I like to say, is especially to the Democrats and to the people. What this is a question that the person who helped me give up the myth of authority used to pose, and he says, if people who say America's or the United States is a democracy, why is there a president? Especially when most of the time the majority of the so-called citizens don't even vote. If this were a democracy, there'd be no president because the majority doesn't even vote. But
Well, well, a lot of conservative Republican libertarians will say, well, we're not a democracy,
right,
we're a republic.
right, that only works to people who believe that this is a democracy or whatever, right?
And,
But
and I hear that argument about the whole republic thing, and my whole point is, at the end of the day, does it even matter anymore? I mean, does it matter if you consider this to be a republic or a democracy? At the end of the day, we still live under a tyrannical government that believes enslaving the entire population is okay.
yeah. Well, right. No, we're right. Actually, right. It doesn't fundamentally matter. The state is, a Republican state is a state. Really the only difference is the rituals that they use to decide what they're going to order everyone to do, or what so-called form it takes. A republic is usually, I mean, definitions change and things like that, but usually it just says that all power is vested in the voters or their representatives, or all power is vested. And of course, that's not. Most Republicans might say, "Oh no, it's a constitutional issue where the government operates according to Constitution," and it's like it's really all just the same thing. It's the belief that some other person or group has the right to initiate violence or the right to rule. Where it's so it really, yeah, right. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's a democracy or a republic or whatever. Uh, it's the belief in authority and the state. A Republican state is fundamentally the exact same thing as a so-called democratic state or anything else. It's just violence. It's a central. It's a group initiating violence or a person initiating violence. And I like to bring it up too is that people believe in government that doesn't even have any voting. They believe they'll call dictatorships and military dictatorships and just monarchism, even like that. They'll call that the state. They'll call that government. And so voting, even then, is meaningless when it comes to the fundamental belief. Like if they believe that individual has the right to initiate violence and the right to rule, then they perceive him to be authority. Or he might not have all of the characteristics that people attribute to a state, but it's just all essentially the same thing. Like a monarchy and democracy, it's just who has the right to initiate violence? Nobody.
Yeah.
So how can there be a legitimate state when it by nature exists solely by virtue of the fact that it uses threats of violence to take people's wealth and control them or whatever?
Well, people don't really think that way when they're practicing statism. They don't even question the fact that somehow somebody gained authority or has that authority. They're just concerned about how to change things or operate within that state, within statism. They're not questioning how whoever may be in power, how they actually have legitimacy or any kind of authority.
Right.
That's not something that people even think about until they get all the way down the rabbit hole. That's not the average conservative or Democrat. They're not having conversations like this where, like, well, how did Obama even get his authority? It's like, well, there was an election.
Yeah.
He's operating under the Constitution.
Yeah. Well, that's what there was an election. I say, well, what does that mean? A bunch of people lined up and wrote his name down. It's like like that's 60 million people lined up and checked the box that was next to this guy's name. Well, what
out of 300 some million people.
Yeah, right. Especially when you believe in democracy, right? And you say 60 out of 310 million. wrote this guy's name down. What the hell? What's that have to do with the rest of us? You know?
Exactly. You know, it's the whole idea that just because there was an election held, we voted on this. Well, you voted on this. I didn't vote on this. And even if I did vote on this, it doesn't give you any kind of authority to have someone else rule over me.
Right. Well, right. Even if I did, I mean, essentially, even if I did vote on it, when I want to end the contract, like if you want to think of it that way, which of course it isn't, but you know, given a thing, if you voted for it, then you should obey it. Well, if at any moment I choose that I want to cancel this arrangement, you know, I have the right to do so. Like that doesn't make any sense to say that I can enter an agreement and I just can never end it. You know, like I mean that I don't know how many people would be trying to sign themselves into slavery, period. But it really doesn't work that way. It's not slavery until you try to end it and they don't let you. You know, and that's just like the whole concept of what government is. I mean, they don't let you end it even when you didn't even sign up. You know, they force it on you, and they somehow think it's different than if it was just some other random Joe on the street doing it. Because right, a bunch of people lined up and wrote his name down, and we were all taught that that creates authority, and we're all obligated to obey. And it's really it's easy, like it is easy to run through it to explain how it makes no sense, but it's just difficult for the other person to see it, or even the other person who's not involved, who's just listening. He has to think about it too, and yeah, there's a lot of dissonance that we get hit with, because that's like I remember when I was giving it all up, man, there's so much cognitive dissonance in my mind. Like I really, really had to struggle to go through to try to figure all of this stuff out. Like, you know, no, that doesn't make any sense. Does this make sense? This, you know, I always believe this. Does that make sense in light of new information? You know, no, not really. So throw that one out too, and then try to figure out.
My biggest cognitive dissonance that was really hard for me to let go. I was really when I was a minarchist, you know, a libertarian conservative type folk. I still, I kind of consider myself a history buff, and I always used to love the revolution, and I always used to consider myself, I'm an American patriot, and blah blah blah, and we're in a restored republic, and all that jazz, and like I was proud to be an American, and I want to restore America back to its principles, and it was really hard for me to like let go of like wanting to be proud of my country. You know,
Yeah,
that was like that was really hard for me to let go because I wanted to be, I don't know, like proud to be in some sort of group of people, but I mean, I'm proud to be consider myself part of, libertarian and ANCAP volunteers, whatever you want to call it. I'm proud to be associated with those people, but at the end of the day, those people aren't advocating for a government to rule over other people. You
right.
know,
Well, right. Yeah, I mean, I mean, all people kind of basically, you know, they want to be part of a group. They want to, I mean,
well, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be with a group of people. There's nothing wrong with having some sort of community that you want to belong
right.
to. But that community that I was advocating for, we're all status at some point. We all were status at one time, you
Right.
know, and you can say that's all of our sins if you want to look at it from a religious perspective. We all sinned. We all advocated for control, and we all advocated for coercion and all that jazz. At some point, we advocated for some sort of state, and I've you know uh, confessed my sins enough to let it go if you want to look at it from that perspective. But and yeah, I let go of that, and I want to be like I'm part of the Free State Project. I want to move there, but I want to be part of that community. I don't have any problem as an individual wanting to associate with a community of people that share my interests and values and whatnot. Um,
We're right. Well, we all have that desire, I would say, for the most part. It's just like what you say about country and things like, right, like because everyone kind of has that, I think, desire, and they all have some sort of sense of self-pride to a point or whatever. They want to be around like-minded people. They want to be recognized, and they want to help other people at the same time in a large way. But they take that, that whole way that our minds operate and the way that we think, and they, it's misled. We place that pride on something that really we probably wouldn't be too proud to associate ourselves with if we really understood it. And that's interesting. Yeah, that was a hard part to let go, because even as a communist, that was something that I never had. Communists don't really have. Well, sometimes they do. I didn't. I didn't have like national pride or pride in the country or anything like that. I don't know why. It was just something that I never really had. So maybe that had a little bit, maybe make it easier to let go of that. But obviously I had pride in a whole bunch of other nonsense in a way that I'm glad I was able to kick that silly belief. But that's a large part of it, is a country and whatever they think that means. It's whatever they really believe it to mean. And what it boils down to, I guess, would be the tax farm. But I mean, it's just a lot of conditioning that goes into it, and misplacing our pride and our sense of self-worth and our values onto something which really doesn't deserve them, in my opinion. And it really just makes no sense to even have pride in it, because like to advocate a state or to advocate statism or whatever, that's to advocate your own oppression at the same time. It's like the state is an agency that rules you against your consent as well. So once I started realizing that was, I think that might have had a lot of it too. It was like, oh, that doesn't make any sense now, saying that I should be punished for disobeying things that I don't even agree with or whatever. Like I said, what do you think should happen to people who break laws that you disagree with? And they're like, oh, well, we should all obey them because it's the law. And I was like, so you think that everyone should be punished for breaking laws that you don't even think should be laws? Well, yeah, it's the law. And it's like, well, that's insane. Like, you don't even think that the laws are moral, and you still think that we should be punished for breaking them. Like, that's where it gets really like misplaced pride and the sense of desire to belong. It's just we have that to a point where
I'll have conversations with people about.
Go ahead.
I'll have conversation with people about laws and whatnot, and if it's illegal, they should be thrown in jail. And I always try to use the whole argument of like, well, it was there a victim? Was someone hurt by whatever this person was doing? Were
Yeah.
they assaulted, or any kind of, was property stolen? Were they affected in a way that wasn't just emotional, where it was actually some harm was actually done? And if it's no, if it's like two consenting adults doing a transaction, whatever that transaction may be, uh, it's not, just because it's illegal doesn't mean it's immoral, or it's an unjust law. If the law is unjust, there's no law at all.
Right.
And there is no victim, there is no crime.
Right.
And somehow sometimes I find that um, kind of way of thinking, when you kind of break it down to simplistic ways of like, if there's no victim, there is no crime type of scenario, people sort of they start like, yeah, you got a point there. And like I like to bring up everything from with no victim, no crime. Obviously, drug war stuff, people get that. Shouldn't throw someone in a cage for having a plant in their pocket. You know, but I even make the argument like, what about throwing someone away into a cage for a long time just because they avoided theft via taxation? Or
Yeah.
should we throw people in jail for not having the proper documentation to start a business?
Yeah.
You
Right.
know, like, do people need permission to, like, do they have to pay to get permission to start something? No, they should be able to just do it.
Yeah. Right. Well, right. The only, essentially the only permission that they would need would be whoever the so-called property owner is, if they're trading property or renting out a storefront or something like that, right? Like
Well,
the taxation.
that's the
Yeah, that's the property right concept. Which, I mean, what's interesting is
that's the
libertarians.
person that owns that actual property. If they're renting it out, then
Well, what's interesting with libertarians is they do have a pretty firm understanding and belief in property rights, which they then violate or advocate violating through taxation and all other manner of regulation and whatnot. Libertarians aren't too big on regulation, but when it comes down to it, like, does that mean that they oppose every single so-called zoning law? I mean, philosophically, yeah, you necessarily have to, because really the argument is about the state. The argument is about government itself and initiation of force. So um, all of this is basically starting from the belief that the state has the right to rule. Otherwise, if they don't have the right to rule, who cares what their zoning laws are? That's up to the people who live directly there. Like, not to say that they can tell that guy that he can't build something right there if it's not their stuff. Just, if he builds something that's crossing over onto this guy, or it's gonna blow up or something. People have some sort of interest in saying, hey, you're building nuclear bombs next to me or whatever. Which there's a really good article about nuclear weapons on the Voluntaryist Reader, their WordPress. I'm pretty sure they're affiliated with the Mises Institute directly, but it's just, the thing is that we don't even get to that point with government. We don't even get to freely adjudicate our issues or try to come to a win-win reason or anything like that. It's just obey the government. The government made the zoning laws, and that's where all you guys have to aggregate yourselves to if you want to do certain things, And it's,
Somebody wrote this down on a piece of paper before you were born, so now you have to follow it, or
yeah.
we'll throw you in a cage.
Right. Oh, right. And yeah, I mean, there's so much of that every single status falls victim to. I mean, that is the belief, the belief in authority. Another thing too is like how libertarians still kind of think about, or a lot of them anyway, they still think that, to a point, the ones who don't realize that taxation is just extortion, they can still think it's consensual, because they'll say you can move, you can choose which state you're going to live in and things like that. And like how that relates to what you just said about how before you were even born, someone wrote on a piece of paper and said, this is the jurisdiction. So it's really not, it's not consensual, right? Like, you have no say-so whatsoever whether or not the state is there, so to speak. It's like the state imposes and rules by force. So even though you can move out of the area, which is the only thing that actually makes it feudalism as opposed to chattel slavery, is they let you leave, which of course now they've got their you can't leave lists and all that stuff, or they'll put you in a cage. But it still just implies that it's not, it shows that it's not consensual. Just because you can move, it still implies that the state has the right to impose those fees or taxes in the first place. So, your say-so is by definition irrelevant when it comes to the state, and that's like a really hard thing for some people to realize, that okay, just because you can move doesn't mean that they're still imposing regardless of consent in that territory, and that implies ownership. Like, I don't need somebody else's permission to build a shelf in my own house or whatever, or porch on my own house. Of course, the government believes that you do, or the statists do, but that's so, just as where the state doesn't need your permission to impose taxation because they do it anyway. I mean, it's perceived to be their authority and their right. So it's just the bunk about it being consensual is wrong completely. And a lot of people still use the whole "you can move, you can leave" thing to try to rationalize it and say that it's consensual.
If you don't like this, you can leave.
Yeah.
And way back in the day when I was, before I really went down my journey, I hate to say it, I was that person. I hate the fact that I was. I hate it. And I kind of use that with people that say if you don't like it, you can leave. I kind of like saying that now to conservatives. Like, if you don't like it, you can leave. And if you really want to leave, advocate for secession. That would be leaving.
Yeah, right. Well, that would essentially be defending yourself, essentially, as long as you're not still trying to advocate a state, which they probably would. But right, yeah, I mean, yeah, right. Why not advocate for secession? And here's another thing too: is they think that even that whole movement and group and stuff like that, they still talk about, like, we need to vote for this and stuff. We need to get the states to vote on whether or not they're going to secede. It's like, no, I mean, that's the same backwards belief that voting libertarians believe. It's like, you're understanding that this is immoral and you don't want anything to do with it, So what you need to do in your mind is you need to go ask their permission to leave. Like, what if you lose the vote to secede? You know, so well, I guess we got to obey. You know, I guess we're not seceding today. We should have another vote tomorrow and see how it goes.
Yeah,
It's
we'll
like,
have some meetings and we'll have some votes and we'll have a committee to go over, discuss it, and yeah,
yeah, and
uh,
hopefully we win.
yeah. And if we
If
don't, well, we'll just have to follow the rules that they dictate to us.
right, yeah, I mean it really is all just various implementations or various branches off the same tree. You know, it's all the same logic. The whole concept of we need to vote the states to vote for secession, or we need the state legislature to vote on whether or not we should secede. And it's like, you know, that doesn't make any sense. Either you have the right to secede, you have the right to cancel the contract, or however you'd want to view it, which of course government's not contractual or anything like that. But if they want to view it that way, you know, which a lot of times that's what we're taught, you know, it's consent of the governed and it's contractual and we all agreed to it and stuff like that. I mean, even if that's the case, you don't need to ask their permission to cancel, right? You might like say for a cell phone contract, there might be stipulations saying if you cancel before you get charged $100 or $200. Of course, it's pretty outrageous now, but that still doesn't. It's not like they're saying you can't cancel, you know. And
Yeah.
that's kind of like what the whole belief is. Well, if we vote to secede and the state legislature doesn't agree, then I guess we don't secede. It's like, would you say that if, you know, if T-Mobile or whoever said that you're not allowed? Well, I'm going to call T-Mobile and see if I'm allowed to cancel this because I'm not really liking it. But oh well, they said no, so I guess I'll call them up tomorrow and we'll try again. You know, it's mind blowing how
Well, but
deep it runs.
what really bothers me is these same people, a lot of them that say that as well are conservatives. But even then, if they're proud to be an American and all that jazz, these people, you know, that have a fond, reverence for the American Revolution. You know, the people that fought the American Revolution didn't ask permission. Like, well, should we should we fight back against the British?
Yeah,
You know, I mean, the war started before the Declaration was even signed, before the Continental Congress got together. Like, well, there's fighting. Maybe we should have a vote. I mean, it was already it was already going on. The revolution
yeah.
started before the Declaration of Independence. Like, people were like standing up against the tyranny of King George. So you know, I mean, these people were standing up and fighting up against what they saw was something that was immoral. They didn't seek for a vote. They didn't go, you know, like, well, we need to have a vote to determine whether or not that
Yeah.
we should not participate.
Well, right, and it would be like, right, it would be like them going and trying to have a vote over there in Parliament about it. You know, we need to go we need to go vote in the British Parliament on whether or not we should be part of British Parliament or not, or whatever. Like, or I mean, the British monarchy rather. And yeah, it's like it doesn't make any sense, right? It's still just perpetuating they're still caught in the loop that there is authority, that they need permission of authority to be free from authority, you know, and you're never going to get it. It's logically impossible. I mean, unless the slave owner really came to some realization where he viewed slavery was immoral, in which case you wouldn't need to ask him permission anyway. He would just stop chaining you or whatever, you know. But like, I don't.
Yeah, you didn't hear about a bunch of when child slavery was being conducted in this country. You didn't hear about a bunch of slaves getting together and having a vote or even signing a petition to their master for less lashes or looser chains.
Yeah, that's a good analogy right there, right?
Yeah, no, they got the hell off of that
Yeah.
plantation as fast as they could, or they revolted, or they actually believed it and they went along with it.
Right, yeah. No, I mean that's like largely, you know, just it's pretty despicable and disheartening to think about. Like, think of the people who were born slaves and that's all they knew, you know. It's like they were raised in that, you know. They might you know, the black people that were taken from Africa and brought over here, they, you know, there's probably generations of poor slaves that didn't even know what Africa was, you know. They just, that was their life, and it gets to the point where they really believe it, and that's essentially the same exact thing
Yeah. Well, that's what we
that goes
face
on with
now.
statism. Right.
That's what we face now. I mean, we are all born in this system. I don't. A lot of people in the liberty movement compare it to the Matrix. I do it too because it's such an easy comparison.
Oh
But
yeah.
it's the system we live in. We were born into this system, not knowing really, what it's like to actually be free because we've all been born into this system where there are rulers that rule over us.
Right. Right, and we're all taught that that's how it is,
It's
and that's how it
supposed to be.
should be, and it's legitimate, and right, I mean, if that's what you're taught your whole life, I mean, why would anybody question it, especially when everybody else believes it? Thankfully, not everybody else believes it, and even people who did believe it are capable of giving that up, so
Yeah.
like we did, and thank they can't keep up with the flow of information on the
It's
internet,
No. I
so
mean, they're trying to control the technology and the internet as much as they can, but it's the internet and technology is moving at such high speeds, advancing that you can't stop the signal. You can't stop the message. It's still going to get out. People are still going to learn the truth. Our number, in my opinion, I think, even though this far down the rabbit hole, all right, we're not exactly strong numbers.
yeah.
I mean, I don't know what you would rate it as. I would say there's probably 10 to 30,000 people that maybe think the way we do, maybe more, maybe less, I don't know, but there's a hell of a lot more people right above that haven't got to this point that probably will at some point.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's millions of people that still are close to getting there, and every day you see more and more people waking up.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, there's millions of people that are anti-state in sentiment and everything. They just don't fully understand how the state is always criminal or how government is illegitimate entirely, so but I mean maybe they'll get there, especially with the information out there, they have to want to be open to it though. That's the thing, is it's never comfortable
They
questioning
have they
things
have
that
to
you've
they have to
believed.
want to open that door, man. They have to want to open it, and we can show them that. Other people can show them that information. They just have to want to open it.
Yeah, basically. I mean, that's one of my friends. He's like, you've walked out of the forest, and so it's like you're on the outside of the forest. Like, hey, look at, we don't have to be in the forest anymore. We can walk out of the forest or walk out of the shadow or whatever. And but it's difficult. Yeah, it is, because they have to want to, instead of just looking at me on the outside like that guy's crazy. Like if a couple more people go over there and we're all starting to think about it, like, oh, okay, maybe that'll. I mean, even though, I mean, there might be a lot of people who just go to it and come to it just because they want to be part of a group, and they don't like government. They might not fully understand the principles, which could lead to problems in the future. Like, that's the whole thing. The whole reason I'm so um, into debating the libertarians and stuff is because philosophically, like, we are opposed. Like libertarians, a lot of times they kind of blanket everyone who's pro liberty, at least in propaganda or rhetoric, as a libertarian. But when it comes down to it, limited or statists will initiate force. That's the thing. If they believe in the state, they're going to advocate or initiate force against peaceful people, and that's where we are opposed. Like, that will be the end result. And so I'm just trying to explain that part, and that's one of the reasons I really like to talk to the libertarians and the socialists, because they're completely cockamamie nuts. So the problem with the libertarians, though, is that even though they say they like liberty, when it comes down to it, they're going to initiate force, because that's the belief, and we won't have a free society then. We're going to have some group that's perceived to have authority, and they're going to be
Well,
running around clubbing
I,
people.
I completely agree with you, man. That's why, I mean, if you watch some of the other videos I have on my channel, they're really dedicated toward those libertarian minarchists where they still believe that some sort of authority needs to be used uh, forcefully against others that, aren't going along. Hell, that's
Yeah.
why, like, this flag behind me, I use it just for symbolism purposes because, a lot of conservatives, they understand the Gadsden flag. They get that, it's the flag of the revolution and all that jazz. But I like using the ANCAP stuff because it's kind of like, well, why is it black and yellow? And it's a conversation piece. I've had people message me all the time, like, I love the Gadsden flag, but what does the black mean? I'm like, black means no authority,
Yeah.
lack of a state and all that jazz. And I use it more so. I mean, as an individualist, voluntarist, ANCAP, whatnot. You know, I don't pledge allegiance to anyone except for myself. Um, but I use this as more so just as a symbol to try and reach out to those people that are, minarchists that still believe in the state and whatnot. Because a lot of Tea Partiers use the Gadsden flag, so it's kind of one of those things where like they'll see this and maybe will watch a video or something like that. They'll watch through it because I have some sort of symbol. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
I'm
right.
just trying to use it as a
An opener,
way.
yeah.
An
Try
opener.
to get some common ground. Like, yeah, like I agree with "Don't tread on me." Exactly. Here's where you're contradicting yourself. That's
Yeah.
basically what it. Not to be so blunt with it. I try not to be, but oftentimes I am, and that's why I think I don't even know if we talked about our pages or whatever, because I know you're on statism and slavery, and our page is called Anarchy for Liberty, but that's like a lot of the jazz I've gotten on there is because I go to the libertarian groups and I say, this is why what you're saying is inconsistent with what you just said a minute ago, and they view it as me just calling them names and nitpicking and worrying about superficial differences when it's not a superficial difference. It's a fundamental difference, and but I think that this is a lot of it. It's good to have common ground. Like, that's a good opener. I try to have some common ground, but mostly I just, I'm going to say, no, look, this is contradictory. This is why this is wrong. That's why you're contradicting yourself, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like I'm a little bit more just blunt with it. So I guess
Sometimes you gotta be blunt. I mean, sometimes some people just need that push off the cliff. You know what I'm saying?
yeah.
Sometimes they need that hard little push.
Yeah. Well, you hope. I mean, hopefully they want to take the leap themselves. I mean, you can't force anyone to
No, no,
even
you can't.
to
You
understand it.
can't. But
No, I know what you're gonna
sometimes,
say. Metaphorically, absolutely.
metaphorically, yeah.
Like, you need to just sometimes just let it all out, because I mean that's the thing, is like there's no point in playing along with the delusion, in my view. If we play along with the delusion, it could, they might never leave it, because they're just going to keep saying, well, if he goes with me on that part, then I must be right. I've just justified myself, or my beliefs have just become justified. So I just try to cut right to the root and expose it for what it is. And yeah, it could be a little difficult, because I mean, all it is dissonance and conditioning, and they get all emotionally worked up. I mean, I went through it. Everybody went through it who gave up the belief. So I mean, I understand what they're going through, but I mean, nobody really pulled any punches with me. It was just,
Yeah.
no, this is like, well, why do you think that? Well, why do you think that? Well, why do you think that? Well, what about this? Well, what about this? So it was just like, whoa, it was a constant barrage of questioning my religion, literally. So it's going to be upsetting for the person who's going through it when everything you believed is being exposed as inconsistent with reality from top to bottom. And like it could push him away. It could push him over the edge. It could push him over the edge to realizing, yeah, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. But like you said earlier, it's not going to happen in one convo. It's not going to be just that one. I mean, that one post might get him thinking. That one article, that one video might get him thinking. But it's going to take them time to tear it all apart. And that's where patience is key. I try to be a little patient, but sometimes I'm just like, okay, well, like when it comes down to it, if the person just wants to do nothing but rehash propaganda, then there's really nothing I can do or say, because you can tell if they came there just to tell you you're wrong. Which, I mean, granted, I do that too sometimes. It's just I can point out the contradictions, as opposed to just, it was an election. What does that mean? Like, there was an election. What is an election? What is an election? It's when we pick representatives. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's when we pick the leaders, when we pick the government, when we pick politicians, whatever. It's like,
Yeah. Well, I represent myself and I govern myself. So what does that leave me?
yeah, right, exactly. So what's government? That's what I like to ask them too. Is like, who decides what laws you're going to obey or disobey? Is it government? Government's deciding what laws you think are moral and are going to obey. It's like,
Those are the
no.
people those are the people I want to trust. The ones that throw all these innocent people in cages and steal from everybody. You
Right.
know, yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Anywho, let's start cutting this short because we've been
Yeah,
going
that's
for
cool.
about an hour and a half. So, anywho, what do you want to plug? Anything your pages or whatnot?
Well, yeah. I mean, I just we have Anarchy for Liberty, which is a Facebook.com/Anarchy for Liberty, and
I'll
also
have
we.
that in the links below too.
Okay, that'd be cool. And the Cop Block page if you want, Northwest Indiana Cop Block. We do stuff over there too, and I mean that's basically it. Just trying to debate statists, and if you look at our Facebook pages, all that information's out there.
You need to get your own YouTube page because there's not that many communist turned ANCAPs out there, man. You'd be a very unique person on there. You need to get your own YouTube channel going and make some videos of your own.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that suggestion. I mean, I've been thinking about it. I made a couple. Like you can look it up on YouTube. It's the same thing. Redblod Blackflag.
Uh-huh.
Slash Redblod Blackflag. Yeah, I've been trying to do a little bit of that and thinking about videos I could make that specifically have to do with my transformation from a communist to an anarchist or an anarcho-capitalist or a voluntarist or whatever. Personally, I don't. Well, we talked about this before with the capitalist aspect and how it's so muddled up, but that is basically what it is.
Mm-hmm.
I believe in property rights. I believe the individual has the right to own what they produce, et cetera, et cetera. It's just when I use that term, debate is over with for a lot of people right away. They're like, "Oh, get out of here." I'm like, I don't even want to hear anything you said. Rothbard, get out of here. Like that's it. Conversation's over. But yeah, other than that, Anarchy for Liberty, Northwest Indiana Cop Block, and that's about it. Delano for sheriff. That's my. You met him. He's got his little mock campaign. Delano for sheriff. That's funny.
Okay, cool. Everyone, they can always find me at on Twitter at Voluntary Rebel. I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Google Plus and all that jazz. Just do a search for Voluntarist Rebel. You'll find me, and I'll have all my links down below as well. And it was a pleasure. Hopefully, maybe we'll do this again. I don't know. I think it was a great first start for like a YouTube show, podcast, whatnot, because it's kind of like a beta test for me. So, all right, and
Yeah, cool.
yeah, it
Yeah,
was
thanks,
awesome.
man. Thanks a lot, dude. It was
No, it was a
awesome.
pleasure, man. It was awesome. We got to do it again. All right.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So,
Peace, everyone.
peace.